All right. So first I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the organizers, and in fact, I'd like to give them a round of applause to the organizers. This is a meeting that, always goes off without a hitch. It's extraordinarily well organized, but that doesn't mean it's easy. I also want you to think around the room here about everybody else who made this possible, from the technicians who are here, the people who served our food, all of the individuals and processes that had to happen to get us here, right? At the end of the day, we're here because we are sitting at the tippy top of a giant supply chain that allows us to put on this marvelous conference here, have this marvelous food, be able to talk about all this phenomenal science at extraordinarily low marginal cost to any one of us, okay? Why is that going to be relevant? So I want to talk specifically today about the problem of how we bring in new innovations into healthcare. Okay, this is a tough problem. We all know that our healthcare system has many daunting challenges, and we're sitting in this room as, I would argue, some of the very best innovators on the planet, right? We're trying to develop new tools and approaches for munging on the huge reams of data being produced by the biomedical research system, ideally to improve the life of the rest of our kindred humans, right? That's the ultimate goal of what we're trying to engage in. One problem with healthcare is that there's a ton of friction to bringing in innovation. So let's try to think about that problem. And in fact, I would argue the biggest challenge we face, and those of you who know me know that one of the things I'm passionate about is health disparities and ensuring that as we innovate and bring amazing products to market, that they don't just benefit the tippy top like us, but rather that those processes and services can really percolate down to everybody else. And in particular, I've become extraordinarily concerned about health insurance in this country. And I apologize for the international set if you feel this is going to be a US-centric talk. In fact, healthcare insurance is a big problem in every developed society, but in particular, it's a glaring problem in the United States, as we'll talk about. And I'm concerned it's going to go away. As we know it. And that'll be good, as I'll talk about it in some regards, and it'll be bad in other regards. And so if we want to think about not just ourselves, but everybody else, how do we build out a tech health safety net that can catch all those folks if they're getting dropped off insurance rolls? So I want to begin here, and this is one of the only slides I'll actually use that has any relevance to the data and things that I do in my academic lab. For those of you who know me, I'm a population geneticist. Most of my interest is in understanding global patterns of human genetic variation, why it's relevant in healthcare, how we use it to study population genetics and history. That's how I got into this in the first place, trained as an evolutionary biologist and population geneticist. But then, in many ways, population genetics, when I started, was a kind of fun and small little pocket of biology. Nobody really thought it was super interesting and important. In fact, when I went to graduate school in 1997 and said that I wanted to study statistics and genetics, people thought I was nuts, right? People said, well, why would any university want more than one person analyzing DNA? It's just crazy. This is such a niche field. I finished my PhD in 2001, right at the cusp of the Human Genome Project, and this gentleman sitting in the front room, as we all know, sort of copylefted for us so that we could all use it, and we've been on this wild ride for close to 20 years. So I'll start with this example because it really illustrates what I see as a healthcare supply chain problem, okay? Where we've got nearly to the end, right? We've got a phenomenal drug, abacavir, which, when deployed accurately, saves innumerable lives, right? It is part of the triple cocktail that if you're an HIV-positive patient, you get put on that keeps your viral loads down and essentially turns what was a death sentence into chronic manageable disease. However, if you happen to be part of the 5% or less of the global population that happens to carry this particular flavor of the HLA gene, well, boy, you should never, ever take abacavir, because if you're giving abacavir, the first time you get extraordinarily sick, your immune system mounts a response, and the second time, you could die. Okay? There's no medical ambiguity about this. It's not like the doctors are debating, oh, should we do this or not? Rather, this is a pure supply chain problem. We should have everybody genotyped, and nobody who's an HLA B5701 carrier should ever get put on a back of year. Furthermore, we need to understand the global distribution of this, and so for the last 5 years, we've been working as part of the PAGE project to first generate an array, and then we genotyped it in 50,000 genetically diverse people from the United States, mostly African Americans and Hispanics, as well as a global cohort, to understand the relevance of this on a global scale. Okay, so this is an example that many of us can relate to. We all agree that this has to get deployed on a smarter way, and we're beginning to make the economic arguments as to how to do this. Okay? And I had to put this in because we'll return to it later. As we know, this is just getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to do. There's the plummeting cost of sequencing where we honestly don't even need to worry anymore about the actual cost of sequencing because it has nothing to do with the cost. The deployment, the lack of deployment of sequencing in healthcare has everything to do with value propositions and not the actual cost of sequencing, because at a $500 or $1,000, there are clearly many, many cases where it's going to be clinically indicated and far more valuable to collect the sequence data than not, okay? And we'll return to this Moore's Law because there's a second Moore's Law that we're going to need to deal with. Okay, you may also remember this gentleman. He used to be president of the United States, and he started a project that many of you are involved in, the Precision Medicine Initiative, which is our national effort to try to generate a big national cohort of 1 million people, participatory, diverse, everyone gets to be a part of it as they want, and then we're going to try to link this to electronic health records and all matter of neat data to do additional innovation and finding. Okay? Great. This is a great initiative. In many regards, 1 million people is now a small number. There was just a bioRxiv paper this morning from Kristen Willer on 1 million people that they've looked at for atrial defibrillation. So having 1 million people is no longer a big deal. And as we all know, a company like Helix, by the way, this is supposed to be up here to say, I've got all matter of conflicts of interest. If you want to talk to me about them, I'm happy to do it. Helix is one of the companies that I'm interested in. I actually don't own any equity in it, but Helix is trying to do a public version of this in some regard, or a direct-to-consumer version of this, by allowing individuals to have a marketplace where their genetic information can get tied to other pieces of information in order to develop products and services for precision health. Right, which is where we all want this to go. We all understand that we'd much rather prevent disease than treat disease, and if we're going to treat disease, we'd rather treat disease smartly than just as an artisanal process, which is what medicine has been. Right, so we're going through the industrialization of medicine, a process by which we'll bring to bear all of the things that we know help in industrialization, lowered costs, improved delivery, and so on. But we're now talking about giving people, healthcare, not just apps on a phone. So how's that going to work? Okay? And I want to now turn to, what does success look like? Okay, what does success look like? How many of you know the PCSK9 story? Show of hands. Awesome. For the rest of you, I'll tell you. Okay? So this is an article from the New York Times from several years ago about the just blockbuster success. This is, in my opinion, the biggest success we've had in genetics in the last decade in studying families with really terrible lipid profiles in order to identify genes that we could then punch therapeutically. Okay? And I just want to quickly walk you through the logic of this because it'll be relevant. So today, most everybody with high cholesterol gets put on Lipitor or statins. These drugs are a next line of defense, and in certain cases, particularly patients with familial hypercholesterolemia, this is a lifesaver, right? These are people who have high cholesterol, bad cholesterol of 600 milligrams per deciliter. Your doc wants you to keep that under 100. Putting them on these drugs absolutely saves their lives and averts 80% of heart attacks. So how did that logic come about? Well, from a sort of conceptual point of view, this is just quantitative genetics. As we've always studied quantitative genetics, cholesterol has a distribution, just like every other trait. And the goal here is to focus on the extremes of the distribution, people with ridiculously low cholesterol and ridiculously high cholesterol, arguing that, well, to get out in the extremes of the distribution, it's much more likely that's happening due to genetics, and so maybe those people have, places that we can discover. So the most, let's see. So this is the paper that really sort of set this off. This was a study by Helen Hobbs and Jonathan Cohen where they looked at individuals who had loss-of-function mutations in PCSK9. And the reason they focused on PCSK9 is because previous genetic work had suggested that families with very high cholesterol, these familial hypercholesterolemia families, had overexpression of PCSK9. So they thought maybe if you lost PCSK9, your cholesterol would go down. And in fact, that's exactly what they found. So this is the Gaussian distribution of LDL cholesterol, both in African American and white patients. And then if you happen to be born with a loss-of-function mutation, look what happens. Your cholesterol plummets. And in fact, if you're a heterozygote, your cholesterol is somewhere between 50 to 75 naturally, right? You can eat as many hamburgers and pizza and terrible food as you want, and your cholesterol will stay nice and low. Furthermore, there was one woman in the study who was a double knockout. She had a cholesterol of 15. We didn't even know that that cholesterol was even possible. She was an aerobics instructor in Dallas, Texas, living a perfectly healthy and wonderful life, right? So this gives us two pieces of information. One, it's safe to knock out PCSK9. People have been living for, now we know hundreds of thousands of years with loss-of-function mutations here, perfectly fine. And secondly, it's hitting an important biomarker. Of course, as we heard this morning, and as we know, correlation doesn't equal causation. Right? So just knowing that this relationship doesn't necessarily get us into a punchable drug pathway. However, the real important part of this work is that not only did these patients have lower cholesterol, they had plummeting reductions in cardiovascular disease, 90% reductions, 50% reductions in the African American and Caucasian patients. Now, there are 5 different drugs that have come to market based on this evidence. Furthermore, there was work on HDL, which had the totally opposite pattern. Namely, HDL, the genetics of HDL did not predict the good outcomes. And in fact, all of the HDL-raising drugs have failed in clinical trials. So now, if you're wearing your hat as the head of drug development for Pfizer or Amgen, where are you going to put your money? In LDL-lowering drugs or HDL-raising drugs? Clearly, you're going to put your money into these. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody in the room? So what's the problem, right? I don't get it. Why are you wasting my time with this? This drug costs $12,000 a year, ladies and gentlemen. $12,000 a year. There is nothing we could do to raise healthcare costs in this country quicker than to put everybody with high cholesterol on PCSK9 inhibitors. Right? A third of Americans have high cholesterol. $12,000 a pop. We've just raised our healthcare spending $4,000 per man, woman, and child through the creation of this drug. And this is our best success as geneticists, right? So we got a problem on our hands here in the way we're thinking about this as innovators, right? Because we can innovate all we want. As academics, we're taught to be push innovators. Here's a great idea. Let's see who wants it. Here's another great idea. Let's see who wants it. Here's another great idea I've had. Let's see who wants it. Okay? And that can work great. But many of the problems we have are really pull innovation. Here's the fundamental problem I got. What's out there that can solve this, right? And so as we think about this room, where we deploy our time and talent, I'd like to suggest that much of the problem that we have in healthcare, as I said, is a supply chain management problem, and that's where a ton of value is going to be extracted through new methods and approaches. So this is the real Moore's Law that I wanted to talk about. This is Michael Moore, a man I have shared very little politically with. You heard from Terry, my views on the Venezuelan government and socialism. But he had a pretty interesting documentary that began to spell out some of the problems that we've got in our country with healthcare. At the time, there were 50 million uninsured Americans. After Obamacare, maybe that dropped down to 25 million. Now we have no clue what's going to happen going forward. But some of the most important things to just wrap your mind around are what these numbers sort of look like and what their growth looks like. So this is data from the Kaiser Permanente Foundation on the growth of healthcare expenditures in the United States since 1960. So in 1960, we used to spend $150 per man, woman, and child. Today, that number is closer to $10,000 per man, woman, and child. This is 2010 data. But more worryingly is the percentage of our gross domestic product that is now devoted to healthcare. 1960, it was 5%. Today, we're at 20%. And I'll argue the demographic time bomb hasn't even hit yet. Okay? There's every reason to believe that the system left alone will go to 25%, 30%, 40% of the U.S. GDP devoted to health care. And in fact, if you think about health care in this country, it's not even health care. It's sick care, right? We literally have a sick economy. $2 to $3 trillion are spent simply on the delivery, and I would argue an ineffective delivery, of a product that most people don't get the value from. Okay? And we'll see that in a moment. So these costs, I would argue, are unsustainable. And for our international friends, this is not just a U.S. problem. Britain and everybody else is facing the same. And in fact, in the United States, and we can argue why this is the case, we tend to put a lot of our social spending into healthcare as opposed to into social spending. Almost all sort of developed countries spend between 20 to 30% of their GDP in healthcare and social spending. Okay? If that were distributed equally, perhaps it wouldn't be that big a problem. But it's highly, highly, highly leptokurtic. You want to think about leptokurtic fat-tailed distributions? Healthcare just beats them all, right? It's like, worse than a kosher or whatever you want, right? Here you go. The top 1% of expenditures in a given year eat up 20% of the pie. Okay, that's not the top 1% of the of people in the economy. Rather, the top 1% of the expenditures that an insurance company pulls out is eaten by 20% of the pie is eaten by the top 1%. More worryingly, the top 5% in any given year eats 50% of the pie. So all of the money is getting spent on the extraordinarily costly patients. Okay, and we can understand why. A lot of this is end-of-life care, and we know we have to have a discussion in this country about end-of-life care. So one way of thinking about this is that we all pay, from the moment we're born, $10,000 per man, woman, and child into a fund so that in the last 6 months of life, we've got about $1.5 million that we can drain down. Okay, that's where a lot of those expenditures end up looking like, because the bottom 50%, almost everybody in this room, is eating up less than 3% of the cost, right? So the vast majority of people in this country get very little in return for their investment in health insurance, right? How many of you here have had to go out and buy insurance on the open markets? Okay, one person, right? For most of us who've got great jobs in health insurance, we don't even know what those numbers look like. For a family of four in this country, you're going to pay $30,000 a year for health insurance and a $10,000 a year high deductible plan. So that's $40,000 that you're putting in, and most of you are getting about $2,500 worth of value. Why would you rationally choose to do that, right? Well, the only way this happens in this country is because the people paying are mostly taxpayers and corporations, right? It's so heavily subsidized, we don't even understand how much our own health care costs are. Nobody does, right? Who's ever had to deal with a billing dispute? Jesus Christ, it's impossible in this country. So, and I would argue government ain't going to fix this. Come on. How many shots have there been at Obamacare? Furthermore, Obamacare, distorted markets in ways that made it, in some ways impossibly hard. So I don't want to get into a political discussion about this. I just want to say I'm not optimistic that Washington's going to fix this problem. Furthermore, there is so much capital on the sidelines, I would argue we don't even need them. Right? There's a ton of innovation that's going to happen that we can help direct in smart ways. And that's really where the meat of this talk goes. So I'd like to set up a model stolen from Clay Christensen, the phenomenal Harvard Business School professor who first talked about the innovator's dilemma. And the innovator's dilemma is mostly it's easy to understand, say, in technology. Let's imagine the advent of Yahoo Mail or Gmail when it first came out, right? Who had a Gmail or Yahoo account in the very early days, right? How good was it compared to your own software or running your own mail? It's pretty terrible, right? It was limited, it was small, you would use it individually. Corporations weren't jumping on to go on Google, right? So this is a classic case of a disruptive technology that meets the lower end of the market. So here are consumers. It's good enough for consumers, but you're not going to put all your national security secrets on it, right? Well, maybe you would. Anyway, so as you're moving up here, there's progress due to the disruptive technologies. Here's what happens if you just stay with existing servers or systems or whatever. They grow, but not quickly enough. Eventually, this eats it, right? This is what disruptive technology is about. Twitter's a toy until it starts the Arab Spring, right? So there's a ton here that we can learn from in healthcare, particularly because we're going to be disrupting from both the top of the market and the bottom of the market. Okay? One of the things that I would argue is that a lot of how we think about public health in this country is very different as to how we think about global health, right? As somebody very interested in global health, we're always, innovation, let's try to bring super ultra low cost technologies. How do I monitor diabetes in an African village off of a 2G phone, right? Those same ideas and innovations we're not trying to deploy in this country, where I would argue, if you're homeless in this country, you're going to have the worst possible health care of almost anybody in an industrialized society, right? So there is a ton of people in this country that require super ultra low tech technologies, but we don't deploy it because the incentives aren't there. So how do we think about the incentives? Here's an example of what the top end of the market looks like, right? What would Nirvana look like? Well, here's a company out of San Francisco called Forward that is what I would call a human health subscription system, which is what you're going to begin to see. You pay a monthly or annual fee, and now all of a sudden you got access to amazing primary care. Everything's digital. Everything's tracked for you. You come in, there's no computer in the room. They have the doctor, the whole thing is focused on you. They videotape the entire interaction and so on, right? This is what, the crazies out in Silicon Valley would love to see this whole thing go to. Let's go to telemedicine, everything distributed in that way, with a rethinking of healthcare to focus on health, not on sick care, right? So this is one possibility of what something could look like. And if you think about, again, the decision that somebody would make, either I'm going to spend $40,000 a year to get a healthcare plan that I may not get any real benefit from, or I may take that same money, put it into a health subscription plan, and then buy some catastrophic insurance in the event I ever need to get hospitalized, right? So why am I telling you all this? Because at the end of the day, insurance is just software, right? It is a series of decisions that are encoded, usually poorly, and where a lot of the uncertainty comes from data provenance issues, right? When I talk to the head of United Healthcare for Oncology, okay, and I say, dude, tell me about panel testing. Why don't you guys like panel testing? He says, Carlos, by the time I got to pay back a panel test, I've lost so much information, I have no idea what genes are on the panel. I have no idea why it was ordered. I know what the CPT code is because it was chosen to optimize my paying them back, right? But I can't make a rational decision on any of the 30,000 panel tests out there. So I've reached a point where if the cost is low enough, I'll just buy the genome, right? If it's $500 for the genome, screw it. I'll buy the genome, I'll own it, and I'll give back that little piece for this one question that we've got to address, and then I've invested in my customer. So insurance sees it. United absolutely sees it. And I said to them, I said, aren't you guys concerned about these guys? And they go, oh my God, Carlos, every day my CEO tells me that Google or Apple or Microsoft could buy me simply with their cash on hand, okay? Apple has billions of dollars in cash. This is bigger than the market capitalization of many of the insurance companies, right? That's that argument. Now you start thinking about where these guys, these are the largest companies in the United States, and the amount of cash on hand that they've got. Why on earth wouldn't these guys gun for 20% of the U.S. economy? It's trillions of dollars. Of course they're going to gun for it. And of course, 2017 already, this is no longer news that tech is going to get into healthcare. Give me a break. It's only a matter of time before Google starts clinics. Why wouldn't they? Can't Google buy hospitals? Can't Google deliver healthcare for free in exchange for data mining rights? Can't Apple start up a subscription health service with Apple clinics and hospitals, but where people would pay for it? Of course they can. What prevents them from doing this, right? And my argument is, they'd be dumb not to go into this space, given how big it is and how poorly insurance works today. right? So insurance is absolutely going to get squeezed, and it's going to get disrupted by these folks. So the way I started to think about this, because again, I'm just a population geneticist. I've, tried to think about this problem from that perspective. I just started to kind of bucket some of the data streams that we're interested in intersecting. So let's think about this data stream. This is what we all think about as clinical informatics. This is the data that your hospital has on you. It's your electronic health record, your omics, your imaging, pathology, outcomes, and so on. Every hospital and hospital system is simply trying to aggregate all this data, right? That's what we're trying to do at Stanford. When I come in and say clinical informatics, this is what these guys are talking about, right? And we'll do that. That's not a challenge, it's a plumbing problem. Now, the real challenge is, let me now take all of the Stanford healthcare, I'm going to take this off because I'm, sweating here in the lights. Let me take all the Stanford healthcare data. That's one stack. Now I'm going to take, say, Kaiser Permanente data. That's another stack. And then I'm going to take Miami Children's Hospital data, or Jackson Memorial Hospital data. Jackson Memorial is the big public hospital in Miami where I consider my hometown. Take Cook County Hospital in Chicago. Those are going to be inherently different, not because the doctors are different, because the science is different, because they disagree. Rather, it's all about the money, right? It is absolutely true that healthcare systems make absolute decisions based on who's paying and what's available, right? And so that's an issue, and that's what the vast majority of our time in healthcare economics has been focused on. How do I tweak the regulatory to the payers so that I can get the outcomes I want, and so on. And in a closed system, as we'll see, in Britain, they can solve this problem. However, if I think about the data in 2025 that I want my doctor to use for my care, much of it isn't even going to be in here. Most of the relevant data for managing my health is going to be the consumer patient data. Of course it is. It's going to be the direct-to-consumer streams. Of course it is. We're going to have far more richer and better data about your lifestyle and about outcomes and how they all relate from the consumer side, bar none. And of course, the healthcare systems want to get in on this. How do I bring in the direct-to-consumer data and so on? And of course, it's not going to work, right? We don't want all your Apple wearables to go into an Epic, dump that you then try to analyze. Right? The way this is going to work is that you have to put the patient at the frickin' center of the permission file. We need a giant permission file in the sky. We need a Facebook settings that allows you to share your data with whomever you want and potentially get reimbursed for that. And that, of course, will get built. There's no doubt that'll get built. It's a question of how it happens, how quickly it happens, and when the incentives are aligned so that it benefits much of society or whether it benefits just the tippy top of society. Okay? So in order to think about that problem, I would argue this is really part of a general field of biomedical data science. This isn't, something that we're going to intuit in and of itself. This requires a huge amount of analysis. It requires bringing together computation, statistics, informatics, and deep thought. I mean, this isn't going to be an easy problem. And we as academics, I would argue, have one saving grace. Only one. Anyone want to guess what that is? The ability to call bullshit. That's the only thing that we as academics can do probably better than anybody else. We have the believability to do it, and we have the opportunity to really be arbiters of what's good, what's not, what's fake news, and what are real substantive advances that we should, take seriously and engineer into healthcare delivery. So to do that, we need massive collaboration. We need massive ability to bring data to bear on the problem. And from my perspective, this goes, along, again, a total supply chain from bench to bayside. It's not just basic research. It's not just translation. It's not just trials. It's the whole freaking thing. And many, many, many players are, of course, involved in this, right? And have their own incentives and their own push and pull. But we can sit, I think, at a nexus where all that information is made available in smart ways to mine for value, right? It's all going to be about digital mining rights into the future, okay? And I'll just start with a couple of what I see as just clearly disruptive players. I'll start with color. Color, and again, I don't have a conflict of interest with color, I just like these guys, okay? Color, and this is out of date, offering a $250 hereditary cancer test direct to consumer, okay? Why on earth, if I don't have insurance, would I prefer to pay $3,000 for Myriad's test over a $250 test that may be just as good, right? Furthermore, what scales better? They've got an ability to deliver this directly to the consumer. They've got an ability to do genetic counseling. They've got an ability to tie this into telemedicine. This scales, right? This is buildable in a scalable way. Furthermore, this is venture subsidized, right? It doesn't really cost $250 to do the test. How could it, right? It is the influx of capital to reduce the price precisely to increase the market that we can all benefit from, right? These things are heavily subsidized already, right? So it's precisely that wave that we should try to float. Here's another example of what's coming down the pike. Quest, and this was about a year ago, announced that in Arizona, they can now sell direct to consumer, right? So in fact, in Arizona, it costs about $17 to get your blood lipid anytime you want, whenever you want. In New York, it's $400 and you need a doctor's prescription to do it. What kind of world do you want to live in? I'd rather take the $15 direct-to-consumer test, right? And integrate it into real systems that can manage health, right? Real dashboards that can, monitor and ideally throw flags to you as an individual. Because at the end of the day, it's the individual who has to make the decision. I can try and motivate the physicians. I can try to motivate care teams. At the end of the day, it's about moving human behavior. There is nothing harder than moving human behavior. So how are you going to do it? You got to think really hard and take place from the consumer world where this is what we do day in and day out. Here's another example. This is Inside Tracker. This is another company that has basically set up a dashboard, right? They'll run the test and allow you to, monitor many variables over time. Again, this is just sort of like the readouts of any chemical engineering process, right? A lot of it may be irrelevant and useless, but we don't know. So we might as well track, keep, and then figure out how to use it going forward. And people are paying for it. That's the other part. People are voting with their dollars. This has been a boom to what I would call the pro-am athlete market, right? So if you're a very serious athlete, you're not going to go get your healthcare recommendations just from your GP, right? But you may not have the money to go out and have a sports team to back you up, right? This is a beautiful little stopgap, right? It gives you actionable information. You can manage it and potentially collaborate with others to build out what this looks like. Healthcare systems. Well, you can't completely avoid the healthcare systems as much as I personally would like to punch them because they're at the extreme end of this cost growth. But many healthcare systems, especially these, have realized that it's all about patient management, right? What are we trying to do at Stanford? We're trying to eat as many primary practices out there as possible to feed what is a tertiary and quaternary care system that lifts the entire enterprise, right? There literally aren't enough primary care patients to feed into the system, right? So these integrated systems have the best bets at coming up with economies of scale and experiments and risk, because ultimately it's all about who holds the risk. Today, you are a transient passenger on your insurance. You're on there for 18 months. They have no interest in investing in you. Now, Kaiser, if you're a 30-year member, of course now they do, right? So as these ACOs and other systems are beginning to come online, these healthcare systems in competition with each other have to compete for customers, right? And again, telemedicine, precision health, the ability to use things proactively is going to be a huge potential market differentiator. Of course, the other part of this is just the massive advances that are going to happen on the consumer device side that we get for free, right? How many of us have had that crazy cognitive dissonance of coming out of your doctor's hospital frustrated because you had to fill out the same frickin' form for the 80th time. They still didn't get it right. They're missing this, they're missing that. And as you're walking out, your iPhone says, please don't forget to pick up the goat's milk for your daughter. There's a Whole Foods around the corner. It's only 11 minutes away. It's at $3.95, right? Why can't that happen in healthcare? Well, of course it can, right? And it's beginning to, right? This is one example of a beautiful digital cohort that we're building at Stanford. This is the work of my colleague, Ewan Ashley, that has partnered with Apple to create a heart monitoring device that, in fact, trained on EKG, can predict atrial defibrillation. So Ewan, the top cardiologist of inherited cardiovascular diseases at Stanford, is monitoring his patients at home with an Apple iWatch. That's beautiful. That's what we want. That's what the world ought to look like. Furthermore, as he's aggregating that data, because 23andMe allows the user to own their data, he can integrate it with 23andMe and do GWAS to find additional interesting and cool things. Helix, you could do an exome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you begin to chain these things. And again, similar to how we didn't need to build a plane to get out here, we didn't need to build this room, we didn't need to design the microphones in order to have this discussion, you can float all this into healthcare in smart ways. Here's another one that I'm a fan of. This is Giant. This is a company we started a collaboration with at Stanford. And, this is about as crazy gets. These people deployed an AI chatbot during the Zika epidemic in Brazil and reached 500,000 people at the height of the epidemic. And were able to track their responses to symptoms, the WHO symptoms, and have a fine-grained, tracking of Zika cases in Brazil that's better than the CDC's, right, in some regards. Again, the ability to scale this out, the ability to use smart ingest is a game changer, right? Because you can now have people sitting at the top managing many more lives in smart ways. So let's kind of bring this back in some regard. I've given you a couple of examples of cool innovations. You all have cool examples of yourselves of how things are coming out. Now let's really try to tackle this issue. Right? This is awesome for the Stanford, UCSF, and, Mount Sinai, high-end patient that can afford executive medicine. Geez, we're living in, the world we all want to live in. What about the uninsured? What about when this potentially all goes away? What if, all work goes to 1099 and you got to go buy your insurance on the open market? What the hell's going to happen then? I don't know. I mean, nobody knows, but I'll give you a couple of examples of how I see potential opportunities. And I'll start with an example of the kind of research things that I think we can do here to build out the value proposition to others, okay? And this is a project we've got at Stanford on a disease called Pan's Panda. Pan's Panda is basically, every parent's worst nightmare. Your kid gets an infection and overnight develops OCD. Okay, these kids are super sick, huge anxiety, mood swings, months and months often go before somebody gets diagnosed with this because it often follows a strep throat infection. So it's just really a terrible disease that families endure. And it turns out I got interested in this because there's a big genetic link. We've got a Pan's Panda clinic at Stanford, and one of my colleagues came in and said, Carlos, 40% of my patients have the same HLA. What do you think about that? I go, yeah, it's not a coincidence. It's 2 to 3% baseline, 40% in your cohort. There might be something there. So how do we study this? Right? It's a tough disease. You got to track kids who have strep throat infection. This is not easy. And the biggest challenge is we rarely get kids with active infection. So we know about the ones that had a strep A infection and then developed Pan's Panda, but we don't know about everybody else who developed Pan's Panda. And then these kids also have flares where they get super sick, right? That's not caused by strep throat. So what do you need to do? Well, you need a big digital cohort, right? You need to track many people cheaply and catch the ones in flagrante who get sick, right? And so we're starting a project with Stanford Peds, with PAMF, Palo Alto Medical Foundation, which is another big healthcare provider in the Bay Area, and potentially Kaiser, to basically try to track every kid with strep throat in Silicon Valley. See who develops and how we can understand, one, the sort of population control, those that get the strep and then don't develop Pan's Panda, and then those that go on to develop PANS Panda, as well as those that are going through the acute phase. All of this requires massive technology, right? We want to build out apps. We don't want individuals tracking this. We want the system to be built to track it, and those pieces are there to do it, okay? And this, today, is a disease that, you know, largely is studied in you know, families who can pay for it, right? I mean, it really is one of the, similar to chronic fatigue syndrome, similar to Lyme's disease, the patients who have the tenacity and the resources and the education to get into the medical specialty are the patients who can pay for it, right? And so the idea here is that we can take that motivation, that foundation money, and then push to benefit everybody, right? Because we don't want just strep throat in the rich kids, we want strep throat in everybody, okay? The last part of this talk really deals with what the central core issue is, which is a data provenance and supply chain issue. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that and then take questions, because, as I said, eventually this is really all about being able to go from sample to health claim, right? That biomedical data supply chain and data provenance is at the key. So let's just think about any supply chain, right? This is the simplest kind of supply chain where you're trying to sell something, right? It's got a sourcing, it's got a manufacturing, there's warehousing, there's distribution, and so on, right? This is a pretty simple supply chain. Healthcare is just a very, 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 very complicated supply chain. I'm not going to try to give you a healthcare supply chain because there's a million pieces of it, but you can imagine. There are payers, there are hospitals, there's insurers. It's a bit of a complicated mess, but there are systems that talk to each other and don't track data through. And that's really the key piece, right? The coding today doesn't go all the way to the back, which makes a lot of what we want to do going forward difficult. So how would a marketing team think about this? Well, there are a zillion different tools, right? There are a million different ways that companies and firms try to manage their customers, manage as much information about their customers as they can, and then target, right? Again, healthcare, it's the last mile problem. It's not that a back of ear doesn't work, it's that a back of ear doesn't work if you happen to have an HLA, right? It's a great drug for almost everybody. And it's, you know, it's really at that last mile that we need to be working on. Let's talk a little bit about closed systems. So how many of you know about Genome England and UK Tech? Okay, great. So in my opinion, this is one of the most exciting experiments happening today in genetics, where, and again, the details here aren't important. What's important to understand is that the entire country of Britain has gone through a pilot project where they sequenced about 100,000 genomes in the context of clinical care, which is underwritten by the National Health Service. And the economics of it were so favorable that they decided to literally put genomes in the budget. So when you now look at the budget for the national healthcare system, which is about a $700 billion budget, there's a line item for genomes that the NHS will purchase, right? That's huge, right? Because now you're beginning to talk about massive deployment through clinical indications that demonstrate the value. And this is just genetics, right? This is the closest thing to, you know, sort of a digital phenotype, right, that we can percolate through. But many other things will follow, right? How do you want to show the economic value of using tracking and you know, Fitbit and so on? So this, to me, is extraordinarily exciting, and it works great in Britain because you largely have a closed system. You have a set of healthcare records that can be interlinked with a set of outcomes and then linked back to the genetics down to the dollar, right? So you'll know. In this case, it makes sense. In this case, it doesn't, okay? So how do we think about it in our setting? And, you know, again, I don't want to go into what would surely be a contentious discussion about whether you're ever really going to put healthcare data on blockchain. The point here isn't to promote blockchain or to promote this as the solution, but simply to say that the innovations that are happening in the space of smart contracts, to me, are super, super exciting, okay? Because so much of the inefficiency, so much of the problem has to do with uncertainty, that the ability to have tokens that track, the ability to have permission files that unlock, the ability to have encrypted data lakes is a necessary, not sufficient, but necessary condition to enabling the kind of transformative change that we're going to need if we are, and here's the real radical thing, going to bend the cost curve, right? Again, left to its own devices, by the time my kids are my age, we'll be at 40% of the US GDP. What the hell is out there that can bend that curve? I think it's stuff like this. And again, the idea here being that and again, blockchain's one way, smart approaches to data authenticity, smart approaches for thinking about permission files, smart approaches for thinking about data mining rights. Because again, all of this is going to be living on Amazon Web Services, all of this is going to be living on sort of Google Cloud, so it's all there. It's already aggregated for you. What you need are the permission files to bring things together. Okay, this is to say that, you know, there's already $700 billion that have flown into this, which is about, again, about a third of what we spend on healthcare a year. So this is serious money that's going at least into the development of tech, the development of ideas, the development of personnel, right? If we think about the computer revolution, it was the development of microchips and the people who knew how to make microchips in the 50s and 60s that then, you know, spurred on the next wave, right? We are all part of what is now a transformation, I believe, in how we think about distributed data and the ability for individuals to have ownership and potentially monetization. Okay, so conclusions. There aren't really a lot of conclusions, just, you know, more hand-wavy questions. I would like to leave you with the following thoughts. You know, in my opinion, healthcare delivery costs worldwide are an insurmountable, are a surmountable problem, but they're one of the biggest challenges we've got to both economic growth and human well-being. I mean, it's a massive problem, and one we need to take, you know, head on, and one in which we as data scientists have a big role to play. Not a small role to play, a massive role to play. Secondly, we are part of the problem too, right? We as innovators, we as disruptors are throwing things out there that we have no clue whether they'll lower costs. We have no clue whether they'll improve outcomes. We hope they do, but, you know, we've got to be agnostics, especially as push innovators, and sort of put out there, evaluate, and call bullshit. I mean, that's really what I want to leave you with, right? As academics, as folks that are trying to seek truth, that's the one card we got, okay? And innovation alone isn't going to solve the problem, particularly in this space. There's so much friction, there's so many barriers to entry that it really has to do with figuring out where you can punch. And the last thought is, I think of it as a supply chain problem. If you want to think about it as a supply chain problem, you think that's useful, great. If not, I'd love to hear other analogies, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Carlos, for that thought-provoking talk. My brain is spinning, as I'm sure many other people in the audience's brains are just lots of questions. So we'll open up the discussion now.
So Carlos, that was great fun. And inspired by your example, I want to call some bullshit.
Call.
Two places to start with, and there's lots of others.
Sure.
One is the power of incumbents.
Okay.
Right? So there is a powerful set of resistance for the people who are already eating all that $2 trillion worth of money. So we could take Epic as you called them out. They have been really effective at preventing data sharing. And they're not the only ones. There's, 1,000 registered clinical informatics systems, and they all are really good at not sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Hospitals hate to share, so trying to get two hospitals to share data is trying to get them to, it's almost impossible. They really are very protective from a marketing perspective about not sharing data. And it seems to me
that's why you got to buy it.
It seems to me that, and for that matter, if it's Amazon or Google or Apple, they're also pretty good at not sharing data.
Sure. But can I respond to that?
Okay, good. Yes.
So is JP Morgan, so is Citibank, so is Merrill Lynch, right? But secondary data markets for finance are the core of what a lot of trading, especially smart trading, is enabled, right? So it's about value proposition, right? I would argue there are two kinds of organizations out there. Ones that generate so much data that they can't possibly analyze it, and Facebook and Google, right? So if the data mining rights are made attractive, they're all there. Look, Maryland was part of what, in my opinion, is the most exciting thing we've done in this country, which is the Geisinger Regeneron set of experiments. Right there, you've gotten two firms to come together, and we'll see whether it was economically viable for Regeneron or not. But I think ultimately, at scale, that can work, and the data will be out there, and people could potentially make a.
All right, so I like the optimistic answer. I'm not trying to leave.
Okay, I'm just saying. Okay, in other words, other industries have the same problem, and even industries where people really, really care about the data because it's tied to money, and they figured out how to do it.
Second answer is, are we looking at the right data? So my guess is the best way to predict health outcomes in a broad population for cheap is to buy their grocery data.
Yeah.
I could tell.
Yeah.
What you
100%. 100%.
So much cheaper.
100%.
Genomes and stuff like that.
Absolutely. 100. I think there we're in violent agreement.
All right.
Okay.
So
this circle in 2025 will be the whole friggin' pie. Right? And when I say direct to consumer, I mean all the consumer. All the consumer. Of course, Amazon's going to disrupt healthcare. They bought Whole Foods. They know exactly what you're doing. Right? So those will be the firms in the best position to extract value from the supply chain.
So for those of us who are spending our brain power thinking about let's call them genome scale assets, proteomics or sequencing of some variety or the like, are we barking up the wrong tree?
No. I mean, first, why would I tell you you're barking up the wrong tree? No, I don't think you're barking up the wrong tree. I think that look, as any supply chain, there are lots of interesting problems at every step, right? And so, to me, I think that, in fact, the training is in some regards the most important part. Why will I'll go to the sword and defend GWAS. Why? Not because the results of the early GWAS were so transformational that we've all now got personalized drugs. Rather, it is, by a log, the most reproducible research program that NIH has ever invested in, right? Bar none. I can go out and reproduce Kristen's million-person GWAS and get the same odds ratios, the same hits, down to the second or third decimal place. There are very few other aspects of science in which that is the case. Now, of course, in genetics, we're closer to the phenotype, right? We've already figured out how to take genetic information and turn it into a genotype versus a phenotype, because for a long time it was a phenotype when we were doing microsatellite calls, so we've solved that issue. And we've now got scale, right? We know you can't do a GWAS with 100 people. Give me a break, right? So that fundamental shift is absolutely worth it, and even if we threw out everything we learned from GWAS, right? And so my feeling is that as you follow your nose into the tough and interesting scientific problems, you're going in the right direction. I think the issue becomes, are the things that you're developing going to reach market? And you have to answer whether that's important to you or not. I mean, I think that's the question.
Great, thank you. Subha Madhavan, Georgetown University Medical Center. Carlos, thank you so much for a wonderful talk as always. My question's about data commons.
Okay.
So we see a number of data commons that are popping up almost on a daily basis, public, private, NIH data commons, ClinGen, GA4GH, and so on. Will those help solve any of the problems that you've outlined today? And what does success really look like for these data commons?
That's an awesome question. I would say ClinGen is a fascinating example. Let's think about ClinGen. And again, conflict of interest. I'm one of the principal investigators in ClinGen. ClinGen is our national effort to aggregate clinical genetic testing data from all the labs and bring that information together to improve variant interpretation and eventually build individual level cohorts. What I find fascinating about ClinGen, it is, in my opinion, I don't know of others, it is one of the only NIH projects where we're not generating the data. We're going straight to industry and saying, give me the data. And I'll give you carrots, right? I'll have badges, you can be on the website, you can be part of it, and I'll give you sticks, right? If you guys don't want to participate, let's go talk to CMS and not get you guys reimbursed if you're not sharing data, right? So this is, I would argue, a kind of different model. PMI is also kind of that case. Let's go directly to individuals, recruit them, get folks to invest their resources, and we are a convening body, okay? Contrast that with Framingham or Women Hearts or others. In my opinion, again, one person's opinion, eliminate those. I think those NIH cohorts are entitlement programs. Redistribute that money, right? Because we cannot scale Framingham out to 40 million people, right? You could take all of the NIH money, I could take all of the DHHS money, I could take all the DOD money, I still couldn't follow 40 million Americans, right? But 1.2 billion people, on their own share all matter of information on Facebook, right? I remember 3-4 years ago when we were talking about the NIH large-scale sequencing program saying, why aren't we thinking about recruiting on Facebook? And getting laughed out of the room. Okay, well, back on planet Earth, fine. Don't worry about Facebook. And then, you'll be shocked when they turn around, they got 20 million people, 30 million people, because they could do it tomorrow. They could absolutely do it tomorrow if they wanted to. So, I think as it stands, federal government pays for about 10 to 12% of R&D total in the country. Most spending on R&D is not made by the federal government. So companies who hold data need incentives to want to share, but I think those incentives can be created. And again, if we kind of keep that tagline of being able to call bullshit and being able to create auditable systems, then it can work, right? And I think, Gottlieb's vision for FDA and post-market surveillance is one I fundamentally agree with, right? If things can, look safe, let's bring them to the market and post-market surveil the hell out of them, right? I think the 23andMe debacle from the FDA was a huge mistake. They should not have done that, right, in my opinion, right? It impeded the industry. So I think we can get to a point where products and services are demonstrated safe in a cohort and begin to follow. And at that point, that's where we step in, right? Because you're not going to let the companies themselves tell you about it. Give me a break. We need arbiters, and we need to make that data available so it can be mined and health claims adjudicated.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Very thought-provoking talk. Brian Burr from the University of Michigan. I was struck by what you said on your conclusion slide about not knowing whether these things improve outcomes, and I had been thinking that as you were speaking. And it occurs to me that if you're a pharmaceutical company and you want to make a claim that something helps people's health, you have to show that and usually randomize clinical trials against some comparator that's vetted by the FDA. Then the consumer and the physician or healthcare provider can answer the question, does this help? What is your thought about how that type of regulation does or does not have a role here?
Look, efficacy is in the eye of the beholder in some regard. And I would argue, why do we care about efficacy? Because we're using our money to pay for it, right? Medicare and Medicaid is all our money, right? It's all taxpayer money, and we don't want them, wasting that money on things that don't work. But in many regards, if people are paying for it out of pocket and you demonstrate it's safe, who are we, in some regard, and especially if we can actually trial and validate and solve the claim issue, then it could perhaps be part of the plank that we don't necessarily need, right? The same way that if you're not that it doesn't work, but rather that how many barriers do we have where you bring a drug that's nearly as good as something that's already in market? Right, or slightly better, right? That makes all the difference in the world, whereas if you begin to bring things to market much cheaper, you can have things that are surveilled and the innovation moves faster.
I think to put a fine point on this, do you think there should be any regulation of the claims that are made by companies and new optimistic innovators?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Through the FDA?
Through an FDA-regulated process. So smart systems. Again, smart contracts, right? If I need 80 million conditions to be met to buy something from David, I don't want me and David to sit there and check them all off, right? I want a checksum that says, yep, we're good, right? And that can happen here too, right? You know, in the way that, you know, all matter of information is reported back to us that's on him, you know, that can't debate it, right? Thank you. Phil, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, actually, I just wanted to say, first of all, I'm exhausted just watching you speak, but thanks. It was a great talk. But I was thinking, beyond the BS, I think there's another role for us as academics to play, and that's in the education.
Oh, 100%.
And I think it's really something that's understated. It gives you a specific example. I never, in any way, shape or form, ever really studied health disparities. You touched on this in various ways. For example, how big companies getting involved is absolutely happening. How that's going to, their for-profit organisations, how's that going to affect health disparities? On the other side of it, there's all these new technologies that potentially can make a big difference. We don't really study that. We don't ingrain that kind of thinking early in the learning process. It's sort of an afterthought. It's
Right.
one example.
Right.
So I'd say that's
Because we want
another-
them to, you know, take physical chemistry and have their space groups and know how that works.
Hey, I love space groups.
Me too.
But there's more to life than space groups. And you know, when you're faced with populations, as you talk to as well, where you walk into a population, you walk into a room, and half the people in that room think the flu vaccine's a conspiracy of the government. You know, there's a lot of work to be done.
Huge. Exactly right. Absolutely right. We have a massive fake news problem in healthcare. Massive, right? And how do we begin to solve that problem?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for your talk. So my question is, I guess, a bit more specific towards the end. You mentioned about smart contracts. So I guess I can appreciate that, like, you have to take a lot of factors into account and you have to make sure they're consistent and so on. So, but how would, like, blockchain technology, like, be useful then? Like, for instance, wouldn't that be more inefficient unless there is some other, like, why wouldn't a normal database, like, user database work? Why would you want a blockchain solution?
Yeah. So, great question. So, the argument is that the data provenance path gives you value, okay? And the authentication gives you value. And so having, it's sort of like, you know, why do you pay iTunes $1.99 for a song as opposed to rip it down, right? Because, you know, well, if I buy it through iTunes, I have a legitimate right to use this information, okay? So the deeper, and it's a hypothesis, the deeper that data provenance chain, perhaps the more valuable that is. And so, again, it begins to give you a means of monetizing what are huge amounts of data that we don't know if they're valuable or not, right? That's why it's called mining, right? When you're mining for gold, right, it's not called finding, it's called mining. You gotta dig through a ton of shit, right? And that'll be true for a lot of these things, but aggregated, it could be the tool that enables this thing to run, right? And I say it from having sat simply in a million different projects, you know, GWAS projects where, you know, the phenotypes are kind of crummy, you don't know anything about where this is coming from, right? You got one measurement of LDL, give me a break, right? If you could really get the EHRs, buy access to the EHRs, buy access to the genetic information, it has value, you've got cash, you know, there's plenty of money on the planet. In fact, cash is on the sidelines, right? Why has the stock market continued to go up during the craziness of the Trump administration? It's not because he's given any indication of stability for those markets to go up. Simply there was too much cash on the sidelines. It had to go somewhere, right? So cash is chasing this space, and if we can make the right arguments, people will invest in the technologies, again, to subsidize the cost. You could give it away for free, right? There's no reason you couldn't, except that often people don't value things that are given away for free, so a marginal cost is better to keep them engaged. But that's the argument at a color or something similar. Now, there are other companies that I would say use genetics actually profitably, right? You know, Ancestry had a very successful business, and they were able to sell DNA tests into that, and that's sort of a separate issue. But in most of what we're talking about, you know, biotech, this direct-to-consumer aggregation, it's going to be massive external capital that gets brought to bear on the problem to try to corner as quickly as you can the data markets.
Let's thank Carlos again for an excellent keynote speech.
Namaste. Thank you.